including knitting, felting, spinning, dyeing, and embroidery. One of those knitting classes was the Fixing Mistakes class that this is based on. So he's going to help us figure out what to do when things go wrong.
Things do go wrong.
They do. Take it away, Darren.
Okay, 1 second. All right, is everyone, you think everybody's ready? We have people in the class. So, we've all had problems with our knitting. Everybody, even the best knitter, can make a mistake. I worked up this swatch, and it has a lot of mistakes in it. I've done so many things wrong. I did it on purpose, of course, to demonstrate for the class. But have you ever really pulled your, you think you're going to work on your project for a few minutes, maybe you're at lunch or you're on the, on the park, and you take your knitting out of your knitting bag, and this is the kind of thing you find. So I've got stitches that are unraveled. So how do you fix that? So that's the kind of thing we're going to be talking about today. But first, the first thing you need to learn is how to read your knitting, or how to look at your stitches and identify. I mean, clearly there's a lot of problems here, but sometimes problems aren't as easy to find. So I'm going to look at this other swatch, and we're going to talk about what do we have to do to be able to identify what we're looking at and what our stitches are. So learning how to tell the difference between a knit and a purl, we probably already know that.
Aaron, quick interruption. Can you move your mic a little bit closer? We're having some audio issues.
Oh, I hope so. Is that better?
A little bit better, yeah. It keeps fading in and out a little, so I think you just need to keep projecting towards the microphone. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so hopefully that's a little bit better. So we're going to look at this swatch, and I also put several mistakes in this one that we're going to work on. But how do we tell the difference between a knit and a purl? So just a quick review. I'm going to isolate this one knit stitch right here. So a knit stitch, if you look at it, it has two sides that are kind of shaped like a V. So that's how we tell a difference. That's how we identify a knit stitch. And then a purl stitch does not have a V, so that's one way we tell that. But if we look at the opposite side, the purl stitches, they're just more bumpy. And I put one here on the front of my stockinette stitch by mistake, so hopefully we can kind of see that. So right there is the purl stitch that was put there by, I did on purpose, but it's there by mistake. And so we're going to learn how to fix that. So that's how to tell the difference between a knit and a purl. So also right here, this knit stitch that we're looking at right there, that is a knit stitch, but it's a twisted stitch. So that's why it looks a little funny. It looks a little bit raised. And if we isolate that one, we can see it's still shaped like a V, but instead of a V where the legs of the V come right down beside each other, like the one above it, this one, it looks more like the legs are crossed, and that creates the twisting of the stitch. So that's another real common mistake that you'll find in your work. Twisted stitches, maybe you put a knit where there should have been a purl. This one is, have you ever split your yarn while you were knitting and then later on had to try to come back, and you don't want that in your project? Do you just pull it to the other side? Do you rip everything back? So we're going to learn how to fix that one today as well. So making sure that you're looking at your work and you know what you're looking at is very important, because that's what's going to help you determine whether or not you've made a mistake. So on this swatch, one mistake I made here was I reversed the direction of my knitting mid-row. So it's called a short row, which can be done by accident. I knitted across, and then I put my work down and come back later, and then I purled back across and didn't finish the row, and then I completed the whole row, and that creates this hole. So sometimes if you have a hole in your work and you can't figure out why, that might be why. And I'm going to show you now how to unknit correctly so that you can go back to this spot and fix it. So we'll have to take that whole row out. And so I'm going to demonstrate unknitting. So unknitting is a really good technique to know how to do. And so when I was knitting this swatch, I was holding my needles this way, wrap my yarn. So this is how I'm knitting the swatch. And then I realized, whoops, I made a mistake. So now I have to unknit. And you really want to unknit when we don't have too far back to go. You wouldn't want to unknit like 50 rows or something because that could be very tedious. So the first thing the natural instinct when you're unknitting is for some reason people want to turn their work around and work from the back. But that's the wrong way to approach it. So if you're holding your yarn while you're knitting this direction, if you're holding your project, you want to unknit by holding your yarn and your project the same, and you're just going to go backwards. So this stitch right here is the first one we're going to unknit. And if you kind of put some tension on your working yarn, you pull it tight with your finger. And if you kind of pull your project down right under that stitch that we want to unknit, you can see that it opens up a little window right there. And you want to take your needle and insert it through that little window, front to back. You always go front to back. And then you take that loop off, and now I've unknitted. And so you can go back, I'm going to go back and do this a couple more times. So put some tension on your working yarn, and you can pull down right under that stitch to find that little window, and then you enter it front to back. Didn't quite get the whole thing. There we go. So you go front to back. And it's, even for somebody that knows how to do it, it's a bit tedious and it's not anyone's favorite thing. And this is also called tinking because it's knitting spelled backwards. So tinking. Okay, so any questions about that? Was that demonstrated clearly? Sometimes it's hard to tell for sure. So I'll demonstrate it one more time. Front to back, split my yarn. Be careful not to split your yarn. And then what I could do, just for the sake of time, I'm not gonna undo the whole row unless somebody wants me to do some more. But what you would do to correct that accidental short row is you would unknit this entire row, and then you would unknit this bit, and then you would continue on and finish the row like normal. Has anyone ever done that before where they've had an accidental short row? So that's how to fix that. So now we're going to
quick question about
okay.
what was the name tinking? Where did that come from?
Oh, tinking is knitting spelled backwards.
Yes, Diana J popped into the chat there for 2. Yes, because you're going backwards. You're not knitting, but you're tinking. Yep,
you're knitting, you're tinking. All right, so what I realized here, like you're looking at your work, something doesn't look right there. That doesn't look right. So this is a nice big field of stockinette stitch where all the stitches should look the same. You know, why does that one look different? So you realize that you put a purl in the wrong place. So now we're going to have to learn how to fix that. I mean, knitters know, and hopefully it's something that we'll be able to be comfortable with, but you don't have to rip out all of these rows to go down to fix that. What you do is you knit across until you get into the same column, and so you follow this column of stitches up. There's my mistake, and you just follow it straight up until you get to this loop on your needle. And then you drop that loop off of your needle, and you do want to be careful not to let any other stitches fall off by mistake. So kind of scooch them back a little bit. And then we're going to unravel our knitting on purpose. You see how that just unravels. And so I'm going to take the stitch marker out. Make sure you go clear down and take the mistake out, maybe go one stitch below. And now that really looks like a mess. That doesn't look, not going to make anyone happy, is it? So how we fix that is you want to make sure you identify the loop that's on the very bottom. And then you want to get a crochet hook. And you want to use a crochet hook that's about the same size, the appropriate size for the yarn that you're using. So this is Woolly's Thick and Quick, which is available on lionbrand.com and pretty much everywhere. And so you want to use, it's a big thick yarn, so you want to use a bigger crochet hook. And so you enter that last loop in this direction. And there's an opportunity here to make a mistake. Sometimes it's easy to skip that first one. Sometimes it might be tucked down under and you could skip it. So you want to make sure that there's no other little bar hiding. And then these are called either ladders or bars that go between your stitches. Okay, so you want to take that first one and you're just going to use your hook and you're going to bring it back through the loop. And then now I've got a new loop. How's that? Has anyone done this before? And you just make sure you don't skip any. Okay, and then you take your other loop and you put it on your needle, and now you're ready to continue on with your work. And so that stitch is always going to look a little bit stretched out of shape when you first do it because you were really fussing with it. So it's not going to look perfect. But probably by the time you finished your project and you jiggle it around a little bit, it'll naturally, the tension will even out naturally. So if it doesn't look 100% perfect right away, that's normal. You were really fussing with it, so it's okay. So, and here's another opportunity where you can make a mistake. So when this loop is off of my needle and I put it back on my other needle, you could twist it and put it on backwards. And that's what happens when we have a twisted stitch. And so a twisted stitch isn't the end of the world, but it does make your fabric look a little funny. So here is a twisted stitch, and you can see it doesn't lay flat and it doesn't look as nice as the other stitches. And on this swatch, I did a whole row of twist, or a whole bunch together. I don't know if you can see, like right across here, you can see it looks a little different. They look a little raised. Doesn't show up quite so well. That's why I did two swatches to see. But it's something you could maybe just choose to live with, or you might want to fix it as well. And we fixed that the exact same way, so I'm going to demonstrate that again. But let's talk about what that means, a twisted stitch mount. So when you knit a stitch, you enter the stitch this way, and then you wrap your yarn going counterclockwise, and then you bring your stitch through, and that'll give you a stitch that's properly oriented on your needle. And if you look at the stitch like this, it opens up nicely for you to enter the stitch, and it makes it easy to knit. If your stitch is twisted, so I'm going to twist this one. So when I go to enter it this direction, it feels very tight. It doesn't feel comfortable like my knitting should feel. But if I try to enter it this way, the wrong way, it's actually a little bit looser. So that's a good sign that your stitch is twisted. This one here that's not twisted, so, and you can see if you take it off, it is actually twisted. it should be like this, where the legs are not crossed. And there the legs are crossed. So when we say it's a twisted stitch, we actually do mean that the stitch is actually twisted. And some of the ways that can happen is if you wrap your yarn the wrong direction, if you enter the stitch in the wrong place, or if your work, if it falls off and you put it back on twisted. That can happen. So I'm going to drop down and fix this twisted stitch.
Oh, Darren, this is a good opportunity. Diana J wanted to know how you fix a purl. I'm presuming she means how we might fix that drop stitch from the purl side.
Okay, we're going to do that next. And that is everybody's favorite thing. Not really. Nobody likes fixing purls. Okay. So let's just do this one then. We'll fix this one from the purl side as a demonstration. So it's not as easy to fix a purl. It's certainly not hard, but it is a little bit more complicated and it's not quite as easy. Fixing a knit stitch is very intuitive, and once you do it a couple of times, you can do it quite quickly. So if I were working on my purl side and I dropped a stitch, I would switch it over to the knit side and just pick them all up as knits because it's a little bit faster. But you do need to know how to pick up a purl, because if you're working seed stitch or garter stitch, you don't want to have to keep turning your work over every time. So to contrast it from when we picked up the knit, when we picked up the knit stitch, we entered it this direction to pick it up as a knit. And when you knit a stitch or when you purl a stitch, you enter the stitch in a different direction for each one of those options. So when we fix it, we're going to enter our work a different direction too. So you bring your needle down, I'm going to switch to this one. You bring your needle down from the top and you go under all of these stitches that are dropped. And again, you don't want to miss any. It's an opportunity to miss one, but on this side, it's much easier to see because they're facing you. And so then what we want to do is go through that bottom loop. And so now this is what we're looking at. We've got all of our ladders or our bars on our crochet hook. We have our crochet hook through the bottom loop. And what you want to do, we're going to pick up this one first. So this one, the first stitch, has to leapfrog over our working loop. So that's our working loop. And you want to make sure that you have a lot of neck here on your knitting, on your crochet hook. You want to make sure that you have a lot of the crochet hook through the loop, because when this leapfrogs over, it has to have a place to land. And then you want to hold on to your working loop, and then you're going to pull that working loop through, or pull that bar through the working loop, and that's how you pick up the purl. And so when I teach this class in person, this is where a lot of students do make a mistake, and I'll show you what happens and how to avoid that. So if you enter this working loop, this live stitch, and you don't give it a lot of neck and you don't put your hook all the way through, and then you jump this stitch over, it's like, now what do? I don't remember what I'm supposed to, it doesn't look right. So you want to make sure that you give your hook a lot of neck. It leapfrogs over. You hold on to your active stitch or your working loop, and then you use your hook to pull that bar through. Okay, is that shown clearly, or do we want any other, is the view okay?
I think everyone's pretty impressed. We're blowing Roche's mind, apparently.
Yeah, it really is.
Yes, Elizabeth, I do also love the leapfrog.
Yeah, so you leapfrog, remember, here's the trick where everybody messes up when they're learning, is they don't give it a lot of neck. So you give it a lot of neck, it leapfrogs over, and then you use this hook to pull it through. And you do have to hold that loop with your finger. Sorry, it's kind of hard for me to do while I'm looking at it through my phone. There we go. And now I fixed my loop. I'm going to put it back on my needle and I'm ready to go. So that's how you pick up a stitch on the purl side. So we've done the purl side and the knit side. Any questions about that? And it does take a lot of practice. And what you want to do is you probably would like to knit up just a practice swatch. So that way you can practice doing it without ruining your real project. But if you have a real project and you need to fix it, then you can practice on a swatch first and then go, because you don't want to make it worse. I mean, that's always the risk. Whenever I have to fix something, I think, well, am I going to make it worse, or is it worse? Can I live with it? Maybe I should just leave it. These are the questions you have to ask yourself. Okay, so any questions about that? Nope.
Oh, Kathy shared a good tip in the chat. If when you're doing that, you turn the crochet hook over and that'll kind of latch onto the yarn. Your yarn moves up into, it's called the throat of the crochet hook, that little dent there, and that'll hold the yarn as you pull it through.
Yeah, that's the throat right there. So, yeah, and it just takes practice. And if you practice holding it different ways and practice doing it, you might find which way. I mean, there's not really a right or a wrong way to pull it through. So depending on what's the most comfortable in your hand, as long as you're not twisting your stitch and as long as it looks right, once you've finished it. Okay. So any questions about a twisted stitch mount and how that happens? So one way you can tell, if you're knitting and it feels really tight, then that means your stitch mount is twisted. Getting back on. All right. So what happens if this ever happened to anyone? Okay, so maybe you put your work, you finish the row and everything's good. You put this down in your knitting bag, and then when you come back to work on your project, maybe just one slipped off, and maybe, just maybe, that edge stitch unraveled down. Now this is fuzzy. If you use fuzzy yarn, then it usually isn't a problem, but it can happen. How does that make you feel? So it's not so hard to fix. It looks really complicated, but it's actually not such a bad thing. Again, we're going to use our crochet hook. Now the tendency is for people to say, oh, I know how to fix a drop stitch. So what I'm going to do is I'll just pick up my drop stitches, just like I know how to do, and now I'm ready to go. But then when you look at it, I mean, it looks better than it did, but it's, something's not right. Like that just doesn't look right. It doesn't seem to work. So that's the thing that a lot of people, when you're learning, it's a little bit of a kind of a tricky situation. So what you have to realize is on the edge, this loop is actually involved with two different rows. It comes out of this row, and then it circles and it comes back into this row. So this is actually considered two stitches, but because of the way it unraveled, it looks like it's just one stitch, but it's really secretly two stitches. So what you have to do is you enter this working loop, and you have to pick up both bars. So instead of just 1, 2, 3, we have to pick up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have to pick up each side of that loop. And so if you put your finger in the loop, you don't want to stretch it, but you want to kind of keep those bars separate. Pull one through, and I've got my finger on this one to keep track of it. Pull the second one through. Put your finger in that one. Pull one through, and see I've got my finger there. Pull the other one through. Because if you don't, if you just pull one through, then that one it can kind of disappear, but you can find it. But if you keep your finger on it, that'll help. And then put your stitch back on your needle, and then you're ready to go. And it does tend to look a little stretched out, but again, it'll sort itself out. And after you block it or wash it a couple of times, you will never be able to tell. It'll be perfect. So we want to see that again, or any questions about that?
I think everyone's pretty glad to see that edge stitch demonstration. I know I sometimes make a mistake and skip a row, because you're right that those little loops on the edge, it looks so easy to just go up and grab. Yes. Oh, Wendy wants to know, however, on the edge, what if you had to do, what if it was like a garter stitch edge or something? And you had to alternate knit and purl.
You're in big trouble if that has to happen. Let me show you how. So I've got my garter stitch swatch here. And so fixing garter stitch, you can use a regular crochet hook, but it's a little easier if you have a double-ended crochet hook, and that's what I'm going to use. So this one has a hook on each end, and it's actually designed to use this for if you're doing Tunisian crochet in the round. But as knitters, you know, we can make use of these crochet hooks to help us with our work as well. So what I'm going to do is, I don't have my other knitting needle. So I'm just going to put these stitches on another needle just for demonstration purposes. So if your garter stitch unravels, okay, so this is nobody's favorite thing. And this is always a bit tricky. Even for somebody that's experienced, you have to take your time and think about what's happening. So first thing you want to do is find this loop, because you don't want it to continue to unravel. And that's why it's nice to always have a stitch holder, a stitch marker, or a safety pin whenever if you're out and about and you're knitting on the go, because if this happens when you're out on the run, you can put that on there and it'll keep it from continuing to unravel. But if once you're sitting down and it's time to actually fix it, first thing you want to do is put your crochet hook in that active loop, in that live stitch, so that it doesn't continue to unravel. So now we're going to have to pick up knits and purls together. So, and if you look at this, you can see it's kind of like I've got stitches on the bottom and I've got stitches on the top. So it's almost like the crochet hook is like in a little tunnel. And you have to figure out what's what, like which stitch is, you know, what stitch belongs to what. So this bar here is coming out of this raised ridge of purls. So these are purls, a raised ridge of purls, and that's where the bar is coming out of, and that's where it's going into. So that is a purl, or it should have been a purl. So all of these stitches, all of these bars that are on the top are going to be purls, and you can tell that because you can see them. And so that means the ones on the bottom have to be knits, because we only have two choices, okay? So you want to kind of pull it open like this a little bit, and that makes everything, it gives everything a little, takes the slack out of it. You don't want to stretch it, but you want to be able to see. So this one seems to be my first one I need to pick up. So I need to pick it up as a purl. So I have to enter it from this side. So you give it a lot of neck, it leapfrogs over, and then we pick it up as a purl. And now the next one is a knit. And the reason this double-ended crochet hook comes in handy is we don't have to take it out of the loop. You just slide it down this way and pick that one up as a knit. And then we go back through. And we're going to pick this up as a purl. It leapfrogs over. Pull it through. And now we transition back to picking up a knit. And picking up a purl. So this is how you alternate between picking up knits and purls. Okay, and just put that on, back on your working needle. Try not to twist it, but you want to back on the needle before anything else happens. Now you don't want to drop it again. And then you can see it looks pretty much like nothing went wrong. Everything seems to be fine. Do you want to see that again, or does that look pretty good? Any questions?
We did have a request to see garter stitch at the edge of the row as well, if you want to scooch on over there. But I think, yes, everyone is very impressed that they finally know what to use a double-ended crochet hook for in their knitting. It's a great tool.
Yep. Okay, so I've never actually done this before. And I really wish my first time wasn't on video, but
we'll make sure I go easy on you.
We'll just use logic and we'll see if we can't figure it out. So there is my active loop. And so this strand of yarn is coming out of a purl. So you jump over it, pick it up as a purl. And now don't forget about the second part of that loop. We'll pick that up as a knit. And then once you've established, if you're doing knit, purl, or purl, knit, then it's pretty easy. So now this one we're going to pick up as a purl. So we've got our active loop, give it a lot of neck, jump, leapfrog over, and then the mouth of that hook, pull it right through. And we'll pick this one up as a knit. This is the second half of that loop. You have to pick each loop up twice when we're working on the end. Okay, any questions? It's a little loose, but it'll sort itself out. Knitting really wants to be even. Knitting wants to have an even tension. And the way that it's constructed, it makes it stretchy. The stitches really even out over time on their own without much. Any questions?
I don't know if you have a swatch to demonstrate this, but Susan wonders about if you've slipped the first stitch of every row on your edge. What happens if you try to pick that up?
Oh, I've never done that. What do you think, Claire? I've never tried that. I usually don't slip the first stitch on every edge. I'm not a.
I don't either, but I knit a lot in the round. I mean, it would be the same exact method. Your loops are just going to be longer because they're stretched over 2 rows instead of 1.
Yeah, so it seems like that in that situation, would you pick up just 1 loop or would you pick up 2 ends of the loop?
You still have to pick up 2 loops, I think, because it's going to be 1
stretched
loop
over
coming
2, yeah.
from a row, and then it's going to connect up to the next one. Yes.
Skipping a row, yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something you could work up a swatch and try it and just practice a couple of times. Yeah, I've never done that before, but I think it would, I don't think it would be so hard to do. You'd kind of have to see it before you could fix it. So any other questions about that? Okay, so some other things that can go wrong in your knitting. I think you can see this. So right here where this stitch marker is, we have a float. So let me fix this. So I'm going to pick up this knit stitch. Pick up the knit stitch. Pick up this one. Now we know how to pick up our knit stitches. It's easy. You guys think it's easy? Think it looks easy? it is pretty easy. So there I kind of split my yarn when I picked it up, so I can fix that. But has this ever happened? Have you ever skipped a stitch? And so there we've skipped 2 stitches. You think you're knitting every stitch, but you kind of slip one by mistake, and you end up with a bar like that either on the front or the back of your work. So that's another real common mistake that can be made. And so, and I've made a couple mistakes here, so I've actually done a couple of purl stitches there. So what you do is you drop, unravel down below the mistake. And then we'll just pick all those up as knits. And so we'll be able to knit that bar that we floated that we didn't knit by mistake. Okay. And then this one, we can pick this one up as well. So once you learn all of these techniques, then you become in charge of your knitting instead of your knitting being in charge of you. And then you would just pick these up all the way up. So separate them out so you can see each bar.
I think you got a little too close to the camera a couple times there, Darren. Yeah, that's easier.
Okay. All right. So then you would just try to put all of these back on. Kind of get this soft swatch being sorted back out. So that's picking up knits, picking up purls, picking up edge stitches, and picking up garter stitch. Anything else? Any other questions about that? Okay. All right, so this is going really fast this time. All right, so one thing I'm going to demonstrate, I use this one because it's a nice big swatch, is what you do. So let's just, I'm going to take my needle out. So there's nothing scarier than taking your needle out. So that's not, you know, anyone's favorite thing. So sometimes what you want to do is just to unravel it this way. And this is called frogging your work. And the reason it's called frogging is because you rip it, rip it, rip it. And that sounds like what a frog says. So you're ripping out your work. And so you might want to rip out a couple of rows. And if you're using a yarn like this that's really fuzzy and has nice big loops, then it's not quite so scary. But if you're using a slippery yarn, then it kind of gets a little bit more scary. So, and then you can just put your loops back on.
Can you move the work forward a little, Darren? There we go.
Put your loops back on. And this was marking a mistake, so we ripped out that mistake, so we'll be fine. But you don't always want to
stitches. Allison wants to. Allison wonders, when you're ripping out a row, where should you leave the working yarn?
Where should you what?
When ripping out a row, where should you leave the working yarn? Do you want to stop in the middle or the end or where?
Well, I would really just rip out the row until I pass the mistake. And then, I mean, maybe it would be the middle or in the end. Does that answer it? Is that what she's asking?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and if you do stop in the middle of a row, obviously you're going to have to put stitches back either on 2 needles from the beginning or put them all on one and then slip stitches until you get back to where your working yarn is.
Yeah, because usually you don't want to take any more stitches off than is necessary. But if it makes you feel more comfortable to rip them all off to just complete the whole row, then you could certainly do that. Okay, so that's unknitting. We talked about unknitting, where you knit each stitch back one at a time, and if you do it correctly, you won't twist your stitch mounts. If you're feeling brave and you just take your needle out and you just want to frog it, then that might be something that interests you. You can certainly do it that way. But there's also another method, and it's called a lifeline. And a situation when you would use that would be, so let's pretend that this is not stockinette stitch. Let's pretend that maybe down here was something that was a little bit more complicated, like lace or maybe a fair isle piece, and you don't want to risk messing that up. You don't want to unravel it down to there. But we want to fix these 2 mistakes here. So you don't want to frog it necessarily, without any protection. You don't want to unknit that far back. So one thing you can do is if you take, and I like to use a double pointed needle, a circular needle for this, but you can use a straight needle, and you want to use a needle that's smaller than what you knitted with because you don't want to stretch out your stitches. Now there's 2 ways to put in a lifeline. You can plan ahead and do this from the very beginning, and I've heard a lot of people like to use dental floss for this. But if you put a piece of yarn or a long strand of dental floss on a tapestry needle, like if you were to do it right now, then you could take that and you can feed that through each one of these stitches, and that's putting in a lifeline in advance. So that way, if you think you might make a mistake, then you're planning ahead. So if you're a good planner, then that's what you could do. So you just put it all the way through, and you would feed it all the way through all of these stitches until you got to the end. And that's putting it in advance if somebody is planning ahead. But we didn't plan ahead, but it's not too late. So I'm going to use this, and I'm going to put in a lifeline. So this is where it's very important to be able to tell what a knit stitch looks like. And even though we think we know what a knit stitch looks like, we want to make sure we're not mixing it up. So there is the knit stitch, and there is his friend right next to him. So there's 2 knit stitches right together. And the chance here, there's an opportunity to make a mistake, is if you do half of one stitch and half of the other. So that is not a V, that's an upside down V, which is shaped more like an A. So we want to make sure we're looking at our knit stitches correctly. So we want to make sure that we're looking at the V's and we're not getting confused and looking at them that way. All right? So you're going to take your smaller needle, and what we want to do is, and I'm going to skip the first one just for demonstration purposes for right now. You want to pick up the front leg of each stitch. So this is what I'm going to be doing. Pick up the front leg of each stitch. And so you're going to end up with loops like this on your needle. And they should all be slanting the same way, and they should all be spaced pretty much the same apart. Now, if you get off track and start picking up the second leg, so you can see they're slanting a different way. So you can tell something's not quite right. So the first stitch is always a bit tricky because it does curl on the edges, but it's easy to find because it's the one on the very edge. So make sure you're down below where your mistake was. So does that make sense? Is that clear what's happening? So if you do this perfect, then it's a beautiful thing. What happens is when you are after you unravel it and rip it out, then you don't have any twisted stitch mounts and you don't have any dropped stitches. But one thing that can happen, and it's easy to kind of get off track, is instead of picking up straight across the row, you know, sometimes, especially if you're working with sock weight yarn or lace weight yarn, you might make a mistake and you might go up a row. Instead of going straight across, you kind of veer up to the row above. And so that's okay. If you do that, and then after you rip out your work, then you'll probably just have to unknit 1 or 2 rows by, you know, 1 stitch at a time. And we know how to do that, so that's not so bad. And that way we won't drop any stitches if we're unknitting 1 stitch at a time and being extra careful, right? So we're picking up each of the first leg. So have you guys ever had any of these mistakes in your work? And again, the edge stitch is kind of hard to identify, but just pick that one up and see how that goes. All right, so, and then again, the main time you would do a lifeline like this would be if you have to rip out these mistakes that you've made. See here, I split my yarn, and this was a twisted stitch, I think, originally, but we already fixed that. But if there were several mistakes here, we might want to rip it out. And if it's too much to unknit, and you're not brave enough to just take it off your needle and frog it, then this is a kind of a safe way to go. And then all of the stitches down here are going to be protected. They can't unravel because we've got this lifeline right here. So now you can take your needle off. You don't have to be afraid that it's going to unravel. And that's one thing that people tend to think about is like once these stitches are loose like this, it's not like knitting is spring-loaded and it's going to automatically start, you know, unraveling or spontaneously, you know, unrolling itself. So you don't really have to worry too much about it. It's not that scary. But this way, you can just unravel it, get rid of all those mistakes. Take off this. Stitch marker. And there we go. So now, the beautiful thing about this is, you know, once we put this back on our needle, all of our stitches are going to be oriented in the right direction. We're not going to have any twisted stitches, and we don't have to worry about dropping any stitches. They're not at risk of unraveling. So, you know, maybe after all you've been through, you don't feel like, you know, maybe you need to take a break. You can put this away and, you know, have a snack and then come back when you feel like you're ready, and it's not going to unravel. Everything's going to be perfectly safe because they're not live stitches. And then you just reinsert. So the main thing here, you don't want to use a needle that's big. You definitely want to use a needle smaller than what you're knitting with so that you don't stretch out your stitches. Because you can see, you might be tempted to use the same size needle, but you can see here, I'm kind of putting them through, and you could kind of slip them off one at a time, but you know, whatever's comfortable, whatever you like to do. I like to do it this way, and then that way we don't.
Yes, thank you, Darren. You are too far down again.
Yeah, I try to watch through the video, and then I can't quite see what I'm doing, and then I look at my work, and then I move it. So, sorry. So just put these one at a time back on. And if you didn't do this right, like I do it wrong on purpose to demonstrate the class, but if you don't do it right, say you veered up one row, or you were picking up the wrong leg of the stitches, and some of your stitches are now twisted, it's easy to fix. We know how to unknit, so if you veer up one row and it doesn't come down perfect, then you can unknit one row. It's not going to take too long. And if you picked up the stitch by picking up the wrong leg, we know how to fix. And see, look what I did right there. I made a little mistake. I somehow skipped that one. So if you realize you've made a mistake, you can put a stitch marker on it to hold it until you get over there to fix it. All right. Any questions about the Lifeline or why that's helpful? And I've never put a Lifeline in, and I've been knitting for over 15 years, so I've never had to do that. But it does. Claire, have you ever had to do it?
I live dangerously, and I don't usually put one in ahead of time. I have, however, put a smaller needle in and then ripped down to that on a couple occasions.
See, I just frog it. I just take out my needle and I usually use wool that's really fuzzy though. That's not going to unravel. I really like fuzzy yarns. So, but yeah, there's
lots of ways. We like to live
ways,
dangerously.
I guess. So.
We did have a quick question on how you would put a Lifeline in if you're knitting garter stitch.
I would, let me find my garter stitch swatch. Do people knit a lot of garter stitch? I really don't knit much garter stitch.
I like to knit a lot of garter stitch shawls. And I mean, it's going to be the same method and perhaps even a little bit easier because you can keep between those two rows of purl bumps. So yeah, that's going to keep you on track.
It will be a lot easier. So of course I wouldn't even begin to put it on the purls. You figure out where your mistake is. And like Claire was saying, because of these columns that go straight across, or these rows, it's very easy to see. And so I would just pick up the knit side, pick up that first leg. Sorry, pick up the first leg. And it's going to be actually, I've never done this before either, but it is much easier because you just follow that straight across. And so you would just follow that straight across until you get all the way. And let's do it wrong. It's just fun to do something wrong, and then you can see what it looks like wrong, and then you'll know the difference between what it should be and what it is. So when you're practicing, sometimes I do that. I'll do it deliberately wrong on purpose when I'm learning or practicing to kind of see what happens if things do go wrong. So let's do that. Okay. So just so you can see. So you can see here that these stitches, if it was done correctly, then each one of the stitches would be spaced out and it would look very nice. So you can see, like right here, I skipped one. So if you go back and look at what you've done, then that'll be a clue whether or not you've done it right or wrong. And you can see right here, something happened. I went under it instead of picking it up. So, go back and look at it and make sure it looks all right. But again, if it's not 100% right, that's fine, because when you rip it out and get back down to that part, you can either untwist your stitch mount, or if you drop a stitch, you know how to pick up a stitch, or if anything happens like that, then we're pretty well versed now on how to fix it. So any other questions? Does that make sense? Yeah, but this is actually a lot easier because you just follow that straight across. You won't go up or down.
All right, I got disconnected from the internet for a little bit, so let me scroll back here and see if
I see one person had a question that said, when you're taking the stitches off the Lifeline, can you just knit them directly back onto your working needle? Yes, that would probably be the easiest way, but no, I just demonstrated this way just because usually that's how beginners like to do it. So it depends on what's the most comfortable for your skill level and where you are. So you can totally just go ahead and knit those right off. Even if it's a smaller needle, because that needle that's on it is not going to shape your stitch. So you want to make sure, if you knit it off of the Lifeline, you'll be knitting it onto the proper needle, and that's what's shaping it. So of course, that would actually be a lot quicker. But sometimes with beginners, they feel like knitting with one small needle and one large needle, it might not, it might feel a little weird. So.
Yes. And just a reminder to everybody that the recording of this class will be available tomorrow on Michael's website. We'll try to pop another link to the handout in here as well, so you can review at your own pace. Like Darren mentioned, just make a swatch and try practicing some of these techniques too.
Okay, so that's pretty much it. So this yarn that I'm using here, this swatch is made out of Woolies Thick and Quick. And then this one here is made out of Pound of Love. So there's the label for Pound of Love. And these are available at Michael's, and you can go to michaels.com, and you can go to lionbrand.com, and there's lots and lots of great yarns available. But for practicing, if you want to knit a swatch and practice it up, you do want to make sure you get a smooth yarn, a light color yarn that's easy to see, and you don't want anything, I wouldn't do anything smaller than worsted weight for practicing, because you really want to be able to see what your stitches look like and what they're shaped like. Okay, any other questions?
Looks like everybody's saying thank you here. I do want to remind everyone that we are having a couple other classes coming up. We're skipping next week, taking a little break, but we'll be back July 7th with knitting in the round. So knitting with circular needles or double points. And then we'll be back on July 21st with Fair Isle. So if you want to knit with 2 colors at once, you can sign up for all of those at michaels.com/classes.
Okay, so I want to thank everybody for coming to the class. If you missed, maybe you didn't see the whole class, maybe you started late, but it will be available to watch tomorrow. So you can, rewind it, rewatch things, watch how do you, fix anything. My Instagram is, if you are on Instagram and you want to check anything out and ask, you could send me a direct message and maybe I could answer a quick question. It's Mr. Woolly Bear at Instagram. So, and it's Mr. spelled out M-I-S-T-E-R Woolly Bear. So if you want to send me a quick question or something, I'll try to answer them as quickly as I can if possible. So, all right, thanks everybody for coming. I hope to see you on the next class.